didn't buy the farm in the Carpathian foothills because he loved nature. He was running. After a loud divorce and the collapse of his business in Kiev, the old stone house, surrounded only by century-old fir trees and fog, seemed like the perfect place to disappear. The locals in the village 10 kilometers away called this farmstead Dark Ravine and crossed themselves when Marko asked for directions. They said the land there was heavy, but Marko only smiled, clutching the keys in his pocket. The first week passed in comfort. Marko chopped wood, stoked the stove, and enjoyed a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. But on the 8th day, the silence began to change. It started with small things. Marko clearly remembered leaving his axe on the chopping block, but in the morning, he found it by the front door, the blade perfectly cleaned of wood chips. Then the keys started vanishing. He could swear he'd put them on the table, but found them in the pocket of his coat, which he hadn't worn in 3 days.
I'm getting old,
he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the sticky feeling of someone's gaze on his back. Then the first snow fell. Marko stepped onto the porch and froze. Fresh, perfectly white snow covered the entire yard, and on it were footprints. Heavy, distinct prints of men's boots. They started from the edge of the forest, crossed the entire yard, and led straight to the threshold of his house. Marko shuddered, searching for returning tracks. But there were none. The footprints led into the house, but they did not lead out. Marko searched the whole house, checking under every bed and every lock. Everything was secure. But a new scent appeared in the air, a faint, nearly imperceptible smell of unwashed flesh, raw meat, and old stale wool. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with a hunting shotgun on his knees. Around 2 in the morning, a scraping sound came from above. It wasn't a mouse or a rat. It was a heavy, slow step. Someone in the attic was moving from one corner to another. Then came a sound that made the hair on the back of Marko's neck stand up. A low, creaky laugh that turned into a rhythmic tapping on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. In the morning, he found a newspaper on the kitchen table. It was fresh, dated yesterday, though Marko hadn't been to the village in a week. The paper was open to the obituaries. One name was circled in red pencil. Marko Koval, his own name. Fury mixed with icy terror, he grabbed a flashlight and an axe and climbed to the attic. The ladder creaked under his weight. In the corner, directly above his bedroom, a nest had been built. A pile of old hay, stolen blankets, and pillows. Around it lay empty cans of food that had vanished from his pantry. But the worst part was the wall. It was covered with his photographs. In every single one, Marko's eyes had been carefully poked out with a pin, and in the very center hung his toothbrush, still damp from morning use. "Do you enjoy my home?" a voice whispered directly behind his shoulder. Marko spun around, swinging the axe. But there was only emptiness and dust dancing in the flashlight beam. He bolted down, barricading the door. He realized the guest didn't come from outside. The guest had been living here for weeks. He had studied his habits, eaten his food, and watched through the cracks in the floorboards while Marko slept. The storm began. Phone service vanished. Marko was locked in a stone cage with someone who had no name but owned his life. He huddled in a corner with a shotgun. The lights flickered and died. Absolute darkness. Then the attic hatch slowly, with an unbearable creak, began to open. Creak, scrape. Heavy steps began to descend the ladder. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of bare feet on the wooden floor. "Marko," a voice whispered from the dark hallway. "You forgot to close the small window in the kitchen. It's cold there, but it's okay. I'll warm you up." Marko fired. The flash briefly illuminated a figure. It was a man, but he didn't look human. A tall, gaunt figure with matted hair and skin the color of raw dough. But the most terrifying part was his face. There was no emotion on it, only emptiness. Marko tried to reload, but his hands shook. Suddenly, something heavy and cold gripped his ankle. He was jerked with such force his head hit the corner of the table. The world exploded into sparks. When Marko regained consciousness, he felt a strange lightness. He couldn't move his arms or legs. He was lying in the attic, in that same nest of hay. It was very cold. The guest leaned over him, holding a needle and thick twine used for sewing sacks.
"You were a bad master, Marko,"
the man said softly, wearing Marko's own favorite sweater.
"You didn't appreciate the silence. You made too much noise. But I'll fix that. I'll make you part of this house. Forever."
Marko wanted to scream, but his mouth was taped shut. He could only watch as the guest picked up his own hunting axe. 3 days later, the mailman arrived at the farmstead. He knocked, and a man opened the door. He was clean-shaven, wearing a warm sweater with a friendly smile.
"Good afternoon,"
the man said.
"I'm Marko. How can I help you?"
"Mail for you, Mr. Koval."
The mailman said, handing over an envelope.
"Nice and quiet you have it here."
"Oh yes, silence is the most important thing."
He sat in the armchair. Above his head from the attic, a faint sound echoed, a low, rhythmic tapping on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't rats. It was the real Marko, or what was left of him. He was neatly built into the ceiling beams, alive, sewn into burlap, unable to move or make a sound except for the weak thumping of his heart against the wood. The guest looked up at the ceiling and smiled.
"Shh, you're disturbing my listening to the falling snow."